May 9, 1945, southern Bavaria. The war in Europe had ended just hours earlier, but the air still reeked of cordite and wet stone. At Stalag Vie, the largest prisoner of war camp in Nazi Germany, the gates groaned open under the weight of a silence that felt centuries old. Among the tens of thousands of faces behind the wire, a small cluster stood out. Women in tattered uniforms, gaunt and stiff-backed, their hair tied in knots, boots 2 sizes too large. Soviet, French, Polish, a rare, forgotten battalion of female POWs who had been moved here in the final months of collapse. They didn't flinch when the American trucks rolled in. They didn't smile when the flags changed. They had survived Nazis, frostbite, starvation, and betrayal. Respect wasn't something they expected. Captain William Aldridge of the U.S. Third Army stepped down from the lead jeep, boots crunching over broken concrete and snowmelt. He scanned the faces, thousands of them, skeletal men in striped rags, hollow-eyed boys no older than his own brother. But then his gaze caught the women standing apart. It wasn't their uniforms that struck him. It was their eyes, sharp, still watching for betrayal. He didn't speak to them first. He took off his helmet. And one of the women, a Polish courier named Zofia Kaczmarek, blinked. She thought she was hallucinating. Because the first word the American officer said to her wasn't name or papers. It was ma'am. The war had trained her to expect cruelty. This didn't fit. 3 weeks earlier, Zofia had been marched into the camp under SS bayonets. She was already half dead from the transfer. Her previous cell, a makeshift women's section in an abandoned munitions factory, had collapsed during an air raid. Dee pulled a shrapnel shard from her leg with a spoon. Dee arrived with no papers, no records, just names written in charcoal on their boots. The guards at VIIA didn't bother with registration. They shoved them into the far western barracks, separated from the men, not for decency, but because no one knew what else to do with them. The Nazis hadn't expected to hold female POWs this late into the war. For weeks the women lived in a gray limbo. No food deliveries, no medical checks, no inspections, just rumors. They whispered about being traded to the Soviets, about being forgotten entirely. And then the Americans came. Aldridge had seen his share of hell. The Bulge, Buchenwald. What he hadn't seen, what no American soldier had seen, was women who'd been prisoners of the Third Reich for 3 years straight. They didn't cry, they didn't beg. They stood with arms folded, eyes unblinking, as if daring their new captors to try anything. Private Joe Ramirez, one of the guards assigned to the West Wing, made the mistake of whistling low under his breath when he passed them the first time. One look from a Belgian sergeant named Elise dropped his gaze to the floor. Later, he said it felt like being glared at by steel. Respect didn't have to be demanded, it radiated. What stunned the women wasn't kindness. It was protocol. Zofia was first to notice it. When they were registered, the MPs didn't separate them by nationality. They didn't line them up and shout. They took names. They offered blankets. They called them Miss, Ma'am, Sergeant. An American lieutenant entered the barracks holding a clipboard and said plainly, "We'll be processing you like any other unit." Zofia blinked. Any other unit. She looked around the barracks, at the lice-bitten Ukrainian nurse, the former Yugoslav courier with cracked ribs, the girl from Minsk with the crushed foot. And she almost laughed. They weren't soldiers anymore, they were memories. But the Americans didn't seem to care. By May 12th, the difference became undeniable. Each POW received a medical check. The American medics, rough-handed, exhausted, didn't ask questions they didn't need to. They cleaned wounds. They offered fresh uniforms. They didn't leer. They didn't touch without consent. Some of the women flinched at first, not out of modesty, out of conditioning. Zofia refused to show her leg wound. The medic, a kid from Iowa, simply nodded and handed her the bandages. "Do it yourself if you want," he said, "but I'd feel better knowing it was clean." He left the iodine next to her bed. No threats, no punishment, just choice. That night she sat on the cot and stared at the bottle. The pain in her leg throbbed like fire. She hadn't had proper antiseptic in 6 months. She applied the iodine. She cried once, quietly. No one saw. The next morning, her name appeared on the bulletin board. Kaxmerk Transport to Allied Rehab Unit, 1600 HRS. She thought it was a mistake. A cruel one. But at 1600, the truck was there, and 2 American guards helped her aboard without saying a word. They saluted the officer riding with her, then they saluted her. Others followed. Elise was sent to a recovery unit in Reims. The Ukrainian nurse was offered a position in a Red Cross tent. A Czech wireless operator named Irina was asked, formally, if she wanted to help interrogate captured Nazi officers. "They're not asking us," she said to Zofia later. "They're treating us like equals." Zofia didn't reply. Because for the first time in 3 years, she didn't know what to say. On the 5th day, a senior American officer entered the women's barracks. Colonel Mitchell, broad-shouldered, leather gloves tucked into his belt, a man who looked carved from Kansas wheat fields. He walked to the center of the room. The women stood instinctively. He raised a hand and said, "Ladies, I've been ordered to inform you that per the Geneva Convention and the standing policy of the United States Army, all POWs under our custody will be afforded full dignity, regardless of gender." Silence. Then from the back of the room someone whispered, "Why?" The question wasn't hostile. It was confusion made audible. Mitchell looked over the room. Then he said without fanfare, "Because you've earned it." No one moved. No one spoke. The words landed like snow on broken glass. Somewhere in Bavaria, a farm girl from Minsk wept over hot soup. A French courier wrote a letter to a family that thought she died in 1943. A Soviet signal officer saluted an American MP and meant it. The war had taken everything from them: dignity, agency, voice. But for the first time since their capture, they felt none of those things were beyond repair. And the miracle wasn't flowers or apologies. It was being treated like soldiers again. Like people again. And in that quiet, uniformed respect, something terrifying happened. They began to believe they'd survive. There was no ceremony when the first female POWs arrived at Camp Ashford in northern France. No flags, no fanfare, just a cold wind over a reconditioned Allied staging depot, a few Army trucks grumbling past crates of Red Cross parcels, and the rattle of a worn-down gate pulled open by a corporal who couldn't have been older than 19. Zofia stepped down from the truck slowly, still wearing the threadbare uniform she'd been given in Stalag VIIA. Her boots scraped the gravel as she walked. Beside her, Elise watched every motion of the guards on duty, not in fear, but in calculation. They had learned to measure men in milliseconds. In the sharpness of their glance. In the curl of their lip before a word. But no whistles came, no catcalls. The American soldiers at Camp Ashford didn't leer, didn't joke. They stepped back, let the women pass first. One of the men, a medic maybe, saluted Zofia out of habit, then flushed and dropped his hand. She hadn't saluted anyone in 2 years. She didn't return it. But for a flicker of a moment, she considered it. They were taken to clean barracks, real mattresses, hot water, a doctor who asked permission before touching her wrist, a nurse who offered coffee. It was so disorienting that Elise whispered, once they were alone, "Is this interrogation?" Zofia didn't answer, but she thought the same thing. They were being too normal, too decent, And that meant in wartime logic that something was coming, a reversal, a trap. But it didn't come. Captain Sarah Whitmore arrived 2 days later. Army Medical Corps. American accent sharpened by years overseas, voice calm as water under ice. She walked into the barracks like she belonged there, not as a guard, not as a visitor, but as if the building had been waiting for her to step inside. "I'm not here to take your statements," she said. "I'm here to get you strong enough to make them." Her presence stunned the women more than the food, more than the bedding. A female officer. With rank. With authority. No one blinked when she walked past the guards and they saluted her, not out of awe, out of habit. It wasn't theater, it was structure. Zofia studied her like a cipher, and for the first time since her capture, she asked a question that felt dangerous in its simplicity. Could this be real? On the third day, Whitmore began evaluations. Not interrogations, evaluations. Medical, psychological, logistical, one at a time. Zofia expected suspicion. She found paperwork. They asked about injuries, education, skills. They took notes, typed reports. They didn't ask for propaganda statements. They didn't ask for loyalty oaths. The questions weren't invasive. They were administrative. And yet, they felt more intimate than any torture session ever had. Because for the first time, someone was writing down her story not to use against her, but to preserve it. Whitmore looked up during her interview. "You speak French, Polish, Russian, and German." Zofia nodded. "We may need translators in Munich." Interested. Zofia stared. "I'm not a soldier anymore." "You're still alive, that's more than enough." A week later, Zofia was issued clean clothing. Not a uniform, not exactly, just something practical, slacks, shirt, jacket, all olive drab. She wore it like armor, not because it was military, because it didn't come from a pile. And when she stood in line with the other women, receiving food in mess kits, and nodding to the guards with the same familiarity they'd once reserved only for each other, a strange thing happened. They began to laugh. Not loud, not freely, but real. A Romanian partisan named Anna made a joke about the coffee tasting like boiled socks. A French courier mimed an over-the-top salute to a bewildered American clerk. Zofia caught Elise humming a pre-war tune under her breath while folding a blanket. None of it was forced, none of it was rehearsed. It was as if the cracks had started to close, and something warm was leaking in through the seams. They were not naive. They knew the war wasn't over. They knew that beyond the wire, men were still dying in the Pacific, that survivors of the Eastern Front were limping home without limbs. But here, in this strange, quiet corridor between captivity and freedom, something else was happening. The women began to assert routines. They swept their own barracks, repaired old socks, bartered for combs, for thread. Some began writing letters, even if they didn't know where to send them yet. The American guards adjusted quickly. They stopped calling them ladies and started calling them by rank or not at all. Respect settled like dust, gradual, unobtrusive, present in every gesture. And not once, not a single time, did an American soldier try to exploit them. Zofia counted the days waiting for it. She had learned to count the spaces between moments of violation, but none came. She said it aloud to Elise once, bitterly. Maybe they're too afraid of their own officers to try. Elise shook her head. No, I think they were trained differently. That was the part that scared them most. That this wasn't theater. That it was cultural. That this was normal. A month later, new arrivals came. More women from other camps. Some had been captured in North Africa, others transferred from labor units near Vienna. They were malnourished, distrustful, hard-eyed. Zofia watched them enter the gates and flinch when guards moved too close. She saw the instinct to recoil, to posture. She remembered it. And then she stepped forward, not as a victim, not as a survivor, but as something else. Not a leader, not yet, but a witness. And she told them, in quiet, certain terms, "They don't hurt us here." Some believed her, some didn't, but it didn't matter. Because the truth had already begun to spread, one small act at a time. A medic offering water before treatment. A guard stepping aside in a corridor. A clerk folding an extra pair of socks into a rucksack. It wasn't charity, it was policy. And it undid more trauma than any speech ever could. In August, Captain Whitmore received orders to rotate back to the States. Before she left, she visited each of the women who had come through her care. She didn't offer hugs. She didn't offer praise. She simply said to each one, "You are not forgotten." Zofia watched the jeep drive away through the main gate. She didn't cry, but she stood straighter. And when a new American officer arrived and called for a translator, she stepped forward without waiting to be asked. She no longer needed to be chosen. She already belonged. The first time Zofia returned to German soil, she wore an American patch on her shoulder and a laminated pass clipped to her jacket that said Interpreter Allied Security. She sat beside two MPs in the back of a canvas-covered truck, fingers curled tight around her canteen, boots scuffed but polished, eyes fixed forward. They were headed to a processing center near Regensburg, a repurposed Wehrmacht barracks being used to sort POWs, refugees, and liberated forced laborers. There were thousands moving through it, broken bodies and empty stomachs, men, women, children, some still in striped camp uniforms, some barefoot, some too thin to speak. She expected chaos. She expected cruelty. She expected to be the only woman with authority on the grounds. She was wrong. The camp commander was a major named Evelyn Carter. American. Female. Zofia watched her walk across the main yard, issuing orders to clerks, guards, and medical staff without raising her voice. No one challenged her. No one smirked. A male officer saluted her without hesitation. She saluted back and kept walking. For a moment, Zofia wasn't sure if she'd stepped into the present or a dream of the future. Later that day, Major Carter asked her for help interviewing a group of former forced laborers from Ukraine. Zofia didn't hesitate. She spoke to them in low tones, translating carefully, making sure the questions didn't sound like accusations. After the session, Carter said, "You don't flinch, that's rare." "I flinch inside," Zofia replied, "but I'm tired of it showing." Carter didn't smile. She just nodded and handed Zofia a clipboard. "Keep helping. It matters more than they know." Zofia took it. It felt heavier than any weapon she'd ever carried. That week, a second group of women POWs arrived at Regensburg, mostly Soviet nurses and auxiliaries who had been recovered from a train outside Linz. Their conditions were worse than anything Zofia had seen. One had been shot in the leg 3 days before liberation and had gone untreated. Another had lost her voice from frostbite. Several had children. Yes, children. They weren't combatants. They were women who had been captured during hospital evacuations, then forgotten, bounced from camp to camp, fed when convenient, beaten when not. When they stepped off the transport, the guards at Regensburg stood silently. No barking, no shouting, no pointing. Just silence. Major Carter herself stepped forward, walked to the first woman, holding an infant wrapped in a Nazi-issue blanket, and extended her hand. "Welcome," she said. The woman didn't take the hand at first. She just stared. Then slowly she reached out. Later, Zofia asked Carter if she always greeted new prisoners that way. "They're not prisoners anymore," Carter said. "They're people who survived something most wouldn't. That deserves more than a clipboard." Zofia started keeping notes, not official records, just observations, things she'd never seen before. American soldiers holding children so mothers could eat, guards fetching clean socks for women who hadn't worn any in months, a clerk who smuggled hair oil into camp because the Polish women said they missed the smell of it. None of it was dramatic, none of it was loud. But it was the opposite of everything the women had come to expect. There were no lectures, no suspicion, just structure, predictability, courtesy. And in that quiet routine, some of the women began to unravel in the best possible way. Not collapse, not break, but breathe. Zofia sat with a young Russian radio operator one evening by the perimeter fence. The girl, maybe 19, smoked half a cigarette and stared into the distance like she was watching something Zofia couldn't see. "They let me keep my journal," she said. Zofia nodded. "I kept it hidden, wrote it on old bread wrappers, dried them under my blouse." "Smart." "They said they'd burn it," the girl whispered, "if the guards found it, but the Americans." One of them asked to read it. "What did you say?" "I said no, and he said okay, just like that." Zofia didn't reply. Because in that moment, she realized what stunned them all the most. It wasn't generosity. It was restraint. In September, a small delegation from the Red Army arrived to repatriate Soviet nationals. They arrived in jeeps with flags and folded orders. They walked with chins up and boots polished. They brought lists. Zofia stood beside them in the debriefing room and watched the Soviet liaison read from a clipboard, calling names. Some of the women stepped forward. Others didn't. One woman, a former artillery spotter, refused. "I will not go back," she said, her voice firm, eyes forward. The Soviet officer glared at her. "You will." "She has a choice," said Carter from across the table. The officer turned. "She's a Soviet citizen." Carter didn't blink. "She's also under American custody, and we're not handing anyone over unless they consent." Zofia watched the room go still. The Russian officer exhaled through his nose. "This is irregular," he said. "And this whole war was," Carter shot back. The woman didn't go back. She was moved to a displaced person center instead. And the message was clear. Respect wasn't situational, it was policy. It didn't always go smoothly. There were mistakes, miscommunications, frustrations. A Czech nurse accused a French guard of stealing her only photograph. An American doctor treated a rape survivor without asking before undressing her. A Hungarian woman slapped a sergeant who brushed too close in line. But each time, something unexpected happened. The Americans apologized. Not defensively, not with speeches. Just simply, plainly. And then they fixed it. And to the women who had lived in camps where apologies never came, where justice meant staying alive, that was almost more destabilizing than kindness. Because now the pain was acknowledged, and healing had to start. Zofia found herself changing without noticing. She no longer flinched at loud voices. She no longer ate with one hand holding a spoon and the other clenched around a shiv. She started writing again, not just names and dates but full sentences, memories, observations, things she wanted to forget, things she couldn't afford to. She taught English to the French girls and Polish to the Americans. She translated birth certificates for displaced mothers. She even found herself laughing, real laughter, when Elise teased her about her accent. She was still thin, still stiff, still careful. But she was alive, and she knew it. On the first morning of snowfall, the women at Regensburg were issued new coats. Not oversized blankets, not repurposed Wehrmacht rags. Actual tailored wool-lined coats, olive drab, standard issue. Each woman's initials were stenciled in block letters on the inside collar. It was a small thing, an inventory detail. But when Zofia pulled hers on and buttoned it up, she felt something shift beneath her ribs. It wasn't warmth. It was recognition. And in the eyes of the guards, the clerks, the medics, she didn't see pity. She saw equality. And for the first time in years, she didn't think about surviving the next day. She thought about what came after. Winter arrived slowly in Bavaria, creeping through the forests and railway lines like a memory no one wanted to remember. The war had been over for months, but for the women still in transition camps like Regensburg, the world outside still felt theoretical. The guards were gentler, the food better, but there were no homes to return to. Zofia stood at the edge of the depot yard, boots sunk into slush, breath rising in white clouds. Across the yard, a train waited, not one for cattle or convicts, but repurposed passenger cars with charcoal stoves and real cushions. A group of women were boarding, clutching their documents like lifelines. One woman carried a cat, another a photograph in a tin frame. Zofia stayed behind. She wasn't ready yet. The others who had remained, Elise, Anna, even the girl from Minsk who used to sleep with a broken spoon under her pillow, had found roles here. They weren't prisoners. They weren't civilians. They were something in between. Anna worked in the supply tent now. Elise had become a liaison between the Polish delegation and the Americans. The girl from Minsk ran the laundry detail and hadn't cried in nearly 4 weeks. Zofia stayed close to the clerical office, translating when needed, reviewing reports, guiding Red Cross field officers through interviews. She no longer wore her camp uniform. She no longer flinched when a man raised his hand too quickly, but she still walked like someone who didn't fully believe in her surroundings. And yet something had changed. No one in the compound looked at her like she was in the way. They looked at her like she was part of it. In early January, the Americans began setting up interviews for post-war tribunals. Not full trials, not yet, but initial testimony collection. Witnesses were drawn from dozens of camps, hundreds of ranks, multiple languages. Zofia was requested for translation. The sessions were held in a sealed corner of the old German officers' club. Tables, typewriters, ashtrays full by mid-morning, coffee that tasted like boiled pennies. She didn't ask to be excused, she went. The first testimony came from a Belgian resistance fighter who had been forced into a factory near Dortmund. She described in calm, flat tones how her overseer struck her with the butt of a rifle each time she missed a bolt in the line. Zofia translated it into English without changing inflection. The second witness was a Czech nurse who had been raped repeatedly in a barracks outside Hamburg. She spoke in broken German, her voice trembling. The American stenographer paused more than once, unsure whether to keep typing. Zofia did not pause. She translated every word, clear, precise, without shaking. Later, the stenographer approached her privately and said, "I couldn't have done that." Zofia didn't know what to say. So she said nothing. The guards started treating her differently after that. Not colder, not friendlier either, just differently. A Marine who had once called her Miss Kaxmerk now simply said Zofia. A medic she translated for stopped saluting her altogether, not out of disrespect, but out of familiarity. The Americans didn't try to make her comfortable. They let her choose how much space she wanted. They didn't pity her. They didn't ask how she had survived. They just made sure she didn't have to survive anymore. And that somehow was the greatest form of respect of all. Then came the woman from Lublin. She arrived in February, gaunt as wire, her face covered in a faded scarf. Her name was Malina. No last name, no documentation. She had walked most of the way to the compound after being released from a Sovietron transport station. Zofia was the one who found her shivering by the perimeter fence. Malina didn't speak for 2 days. She didn't eat. She barely slept. But on the third morning, when a Red Cross nurse tried to bathe her, she panicked, screamed, fought. Zofia stepped in, Quiet words, soft gestures. She helped Melina into a corner of the washroom and sat on the tiled floor beside her, both of them soaking wet. "You're safe here," Zofia said, not as a comfort as a fact. Melina didn't answer, but she didn't fight again. And when she was finally issued a new coat, she hugged it like it was a child. Elise once said that American decency was like a slow medicine. It didn't shock you into healing. It gave you permission to heal when you were ready. Some days it showed up as structure, meals, timetables, rations. Some days it showed up as silence, letting a woman sit in the corner until she chose to stand. And some days it showed up as absurd, gentle kindness. Like the soldier who smuggled honey into the kitchen for the Polish girls. Or the chaplain who sat under a tree and let women speak into the air while he said nothing. Or the American woman who taught a dozen POWs how to sew again, even though their hands were still too stiff from cold. No one wrote these things down, no one counted them. But Zofia did, in her own way. She noticed, she remembered. She sat with the letter in her lap for a long time. Then she folded it, placed it under her mattress, and went back to work. Because she understood now that memory didn't have to be where you came from. Sometimes it could be where you were allowed to become human again. She didn't want to speak. She had said enough in tribunal interviews, enough in Red Cross reports, enough in long, quietly dictated affidavits typed by someone who flinched more at her memories than she ever had. But the journalist was different. He asked her nothing about the camps. Instead, he asked her about what happened after. "What surprised you most?" he said, fumbling with his notepad, "about being liberated." She stared at him for a long time before answering, not because she didn't know what to say, but because it had taken her nearly a year to believe the answer was real. "They didn't touch us," she said. "The Americans, that was the first surprise, the first real one." He blinked. "They didn't touch us. Not when we arrived, not when we were processed, not when we were fed. They gave us space. That's what shocked us. Not the food, not the blankets, not the clothes, the space." He said nothing for a moment. Then he asked, "And the second?" Zofia's mouth twitched upward, not a smile but the shadow of one. "They asked us for help, not to smile for photos, not to cry on camera. They asked us to work, like we were still useful, like we still mattered." The pencil slowed, his eyes lifted. "You don't think you matter?" "I didn't. Not until they asked me to translate for a man who couldn't even look me in the eye. Not until I watched a guard take orders from a woman who hadn't eaten solid food in a month. That's how respect feels, monsieur. It doesn't shout. It allows." She didn't realize her hands were shaking until she looked down and saw the tremble of her knuckles. He left her alone after that. He didn't ask for a picture. She was grateful for that too. That night Elise packed. She had finally received word her brother was alive, a railway worker in Marseille, still coughing from a lung injury but alive. The paperwork had cleared. Her transit pass had been stamped. She was going home. "Assuming it still feels like home," she said, folding her scarf into a military duffel issued by the American quartermaster. Zofia sat on the edge of the bunk and watched her move. "You could go too," Elise said, not unkindly. Zofia shook her head. "I don't know where that is." "Not even a city." "There's a village, or there was. There's a post office somewhere, I think, but no road. No name on the maps the Americans have." "You'll find it." "I'm not looking anymore." The silence wasn't cold, just final. Elise closed the bag and turned. "You'll stay here forever." "No," Zofia said, looking out the window. "But I'll stay long enough to make sure they know this happened." In July, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration opened a permanent office in Regensburg. They requested local interpreters. Zofia was first on the list. The man who delivered the request was the same American officer, who had registered her at Camp Ashford nearly a year ago. He hadn't aged much, she had. He handed her a clipboard and said, "They're requesting someone who understands multiple systems, language, documentation, logistics." She held the clipboard loosely, her thumb running over the ink. Her name was written at the top, typed in capital letters. "Is that me now?" she asked. He didn't answer, just offered his hand. And this time she shook it. By late summer, the camp had changed entirely. The old barracks had been converted into transitional housing. The mess tent was now a cafeteria for aid workers and children. The guards were gone, replaced by case officers and clerks. There were still women arriving, but they came by bus now. Some were pregnant, some were sick, but none were carrying lice in their sleeves. None looked like bones stitched into skin. They came with questions, not screams, with papers, not boot-scrawled names. And when they arrived, someone greeted them, offered tea, pointed them to hot water. Sometimes it was Zofia. Sometimes it was one of the other women who had stayed. Each one had learned the same lesson. Dignity doesn't have to be declared. It has to be demonstrated. And it is best demonstrated in the quiet moments no one records. One morning, a group of schoolgirls walked past the old East Gate with their teacher. They didn't look twice. The gate was closed now, rusted, overgrown. Zofia stood near it and watched them, not with sorrow, not with envy, just with recognition. They would grow up hearing stories of a war that ended before they were born, a war that had names, dates, victories. But not this. Not the silence after, not the rebuilding, not the way a soldier could unlearn cruelty, not the way a woman could begin to feel like a person again. And certainly not the way respect could save someone without saying a single word. Zofia never returned to her village. She worked at Regensburg until 1949, then moved to Vienna to assist in refugee processing. She married an Austrian translator, later divorced him, never spoke poorly of him. She stayed in Europe, never moved west. She kept her American-issued coat until the lining wore through. She folded it into a chest beneath her bed and never threw it out. It was the only uniform that had ever made her feel safe. The last entry in her journal, written in tight cursive on a page yellowed by time, read, "I do not remember their names, not all of them. The guards, the medics, the ones who didn't look at us like prey, but I remember the things they didn't do, and sometimes that's more important than remembering the things they did."